Imagine a doctor telling you that your current battle with burnout, or maybe like your kid's sudden peanut allergy, or even just that weird anxiety you feel when you check your email, was actually diagnosed 80 years ago.
Right, in a completely different generation. It's wild.
It totally shatters how we usually think about our own bodies. Because, we like to think of our health and our minds as these very isolated, individual things. Like you get sick, you take a pill.
Exactly. You feel sad, you see a therapist. It's a very contained, individualistic view of human life.
But the source material we're diving into today argues that this view isn't just, slightly flawed. It is a fundamental illusion that is quite literally making us sick.
Yeah, and it's a profound one.
So welcome to today's deep dive. We're unpacking a truly massive transdisciplinary body of work by Alan Imbert. And when I say transdisciplinary, I mean we are going to be traveling from the macro sociology of how we educate our kids down into the really harrowing legal reality of human rights abuses in foreign prisons, all the way down into the biophysics of how your literal cells metabolize trauma.
It's a massive scope, and the central thesis holding all of this together is that humanity is basically suffering from a profound systemic dissonance.
Systemic dissonance.
Right. We have built a world that is biologically and psychologically incompatible with the human nervous system. So Imbert's work is essentially a survival manual. It's an attempt to diagnose this dissonance across our institutions, highlighting some really profound structural failures, and then to offer a framework for, transmuting that noise into a clear signal.
And we have a very specific map for this journey today. Woven through these documents are 10 absolute scandals like massive institutional failures and 20 vital lessons for surviving them.
Yeah, it's a lot of ground to cover.
It is. But we're not just going to list these off like a textbook. We're going to connect the dots. Because I promise you, by the end of this deep dive, you're going to look at your own body,
Right.
the food on your plate, your family history, and the endless scroll of your social media feed in a completely different light.
We really have to start where the text starts, which is the macro view of
That's
society.
silly way out.
Yeah. So Imbert introduces what he calls the integrated triptych of humanity. And this brings us to lesson 1. Nutrition founds the body, the family founds the subject, and education founds the citizen.
Okay, I have to stop you right there for a second because on the surface, that sounds like a very basic sociological observation. I mean, obviously, food, family, and schools matter, right? What is the radical insight there?
Well, the radical insight is the integration part, because we treat these as totally separate policy issues. We have, a Department of Agriculture, a Department of Family Services, and a Department of Education.
Like they're all operating in their own little silos.
Exactly. But the text argues they are a single, continuous biological mechanism. So if you have an industrialized food system that starves the developing brain of essential nutrients while pumping it full of inflammatory sugars, that directly impacts family dynamics through mood instability and health crises.
Wow.
And if a family structure is weakened by that kind of biophysical stress plus, economic stress, it literally alters the child's neurological development before they ever set foot in a classroom.
So the school is essentially inheriting a biological and psychological crisis that started in the grocery store and the home.
You literally cannot fix the education system without fixing the food system.
That makes so much sense.
Well,
And it brings us to lesson 2 from the text, which is all about biological and social plasticity.
right. Plasticity is everything here. Our genomes, our microbiomes, our neural pathways, they aren't cast in stone at birth. They modify themselves based on the environment they're exposed to.
So it's a double-edged sword, really. I mean, it's our greatest vulnerability because a toxic environment will literally warp our biology, but it's also our ultimate hope. Because if the environment dictates the biology, then changing the environment can actually heal it.
Precisely. But the text forces us to look at what happens when that plasticity is subjected to massive systemic trauma. And this brings us to Scandal 1, the Irish famine colonial policy.
Right, and I want to be really clear to anyone listening right now. The author explicitly frames this not as a mere natural disaster caused by a potato blight, but as a deeply scandalous colonial policy.
Yeah, a deliberate political failure.
And we're not taking sides here, just reporting what the source says. But the argument made in the text is that institutional indifference and even deliberate economic policy by the British government turned a crop failure into a catastrophe that killed 1 million people and forced 2 million more to flee.
And while that historical political analysis is foundational to Imbert's argument, where the text takes it next is purely biological, the focus really shifts to the aftermath. Like, how does a mass trauma of starvation and displacement actually manifest in the survivors?
Right, how does it live on?
The author points out that this famine left profound transgenerational scars. The relationship to food, the metabolic baselines, the mental health of the Irish diaspora, it was all fundamentally altered.
Wait, hold on. I really need to push back here, or at least, like, ask for the mechanism. Are you seriously saying that because someone's great-great-grandmother survived a famine, their biology today is somehow pre-programmed with that trauma?
I know, it sounds like science fiction.
It does.
Yeah.
Because the way we're all taught biology in high school is that genetics is a fixed blueprint. You know, you get your eye color and your height from your parents' DNA, but you don't inherit their memories or their starvation.
Yeah.
How does a trauma physically travel through time?
That is the perfect question. And it leads us directly to Lesson 3, transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. You really have to throw away the blueprint analogy.
Okay, throwing it away.
Think of your DNA not as a fixed blueprint, but as a massive grand piano with millions of keys. The DNA is the keyboard, but the environment is the piano player.
Oh, I'm following this piano metaphor. Okay.
So during a massive trauma like starvation, the body releases a flood of extreme stress hormones. And these chemicals actually cause physical changes to the DNA. They don't change the genetic code itself, like they don't add or remove keys from the piano, but they do add chemical tags called methyl groups onto certain genes.
Wait, so what do those tags do?
It's like putting heavy strips of duct tape over specific keys on the piano, either locking them down so they can't be played or wedging them down so they just play constantly.
So the genes that manage, I don't know, fat storage or stress responses get permanently taped down in the on or off position because the body is trying to survive a famine.
Exactly. The body optimizes itself for a world without food. But here is the truly staggering part. Backed by extensive research cited in the text, particularly studies on the Dutch hunger winter.
That was the brutal famine in the Netherlands at the end of World War II, right?
Yeah, 1944 to 1945. Researchers looked at women who were pregnant during that famine. The babies they were carrying were, of course, exposed to that same starvation environment in the womb, and their DNA was methylated. Their pianos were taped up.
Which makes sense because they were physically there inside the mother.
But the study showed that 60 years later, those children didn't just have elevated rates of obesity and diabetes, they also had higher rates of schizophrenia. And most importantly, they transmitted those biological susceptibilities to their children.
Wait, their children?
Yes. The grandchildren of the famine, who grew up in times of plenty, still had the epigenetic duct tape on their DNA. The environment told the genes how to behave, and that altered behavior got passed down to a generation that never even experienced the original trauma.
That is absolutely mind-blowing. It means we are fundamentally looking at health backwards in modern medicine.
We really are.
If someone is struggling with obesity or severe metabolic issues today, we treat it as an individual moral failing. You say, you know, you just don't have enough willpower, or you're eating the wrong things. But if this epigenetic data is correct, that person might be fighting an invisible biological imperative that was programmed into their lineage 3 generations ago.
You've just hit on Scandal 2.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The author cites sociologist Abigail Sagai heavily here regarding the pathologization of bodies, specifically the medicalization of obesity. The text argues that our media ideals, this relentless cult of thinness, actually legitimizes social discrimination.
Because if thinness is framed purely as a result of hard work and virtue, then larger bodies are automatically framed as lazy or morally deficient.
Exactly. It completely obscures the structural, systemic determinants of health. It ignores the transgenerational epigenetics we just discussed.
Yeah.
It ignores the fact that we live in a food environment engineered to be hyperpalatable and biologically confusing.
We blame the individual for a systemic failure.
Right. We are treating the symptom and judging the patient, all while ignoring the environment that is actively causing the disease.
And it's not just weight or metabolism, is it? I mean, the environment is actually confusing our immune systems, too. I noticed the text dives into the hygiene hypothesis and the explosion of food allergies, which is Lesson 4.
Yes. Lesson 4 points to the epidemiological reality of things like peanut allergies, which tripled in the United States between 1997 and 2008.
Tripled in a decade. From a purely evolutionary standpoint, genetic changes do not happen that fast. A population doesn't just mutate to become allergic to a staple food in 10 years.
Exactly. So if it's not genetics, it has to be environmental. The text points directly to environmental factors acting on how our immune system is educated in early life.
How so?
We have created environments through hypersanitization, changes in diet, lack of biodiversity in our microbiomes that are biologically illegible to our bodies. The immune system, which is supposed to be our internal defense force, is fundamentally understimulated and confused.
So it starts attacking harmless proteins like those in peanuts.
Yeah, it's a biological manifestation of systemic dissonance.
Wow. So if our physical immune system is getting confused by the modern world, what is happening to our psychological immune system?
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that the environment dictates how our pianos are played. What happens when that environment is fundamentally unsafe for a developing child?
That leads us directly to Scandal 3. And the text frames this as perhaps the most tragic societal failure. The absolute neglect of the ACE study. AC stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences.
I've heard the term ACEs thrown around in psychology circles. But why does the author frame this as a massive institutional scandal?
Because of what the data proved and how thoroughly society has ignored it, the text highlights the landmark 1995 study by Dr. Vincent Folletti and Dr. Robert Ananda, which looked at over 17,000 participants. This wasn't some small fringe study.
Right, that's a huge sample size.
It proved a robust, undeniable dose-response relationship between childhood trauma things like physical abuse, emotional neglect, or household dysfunction, and severe adult physical and psychiatric diseases.
Wait, dose response, meaning like the higher the dose of trauma, the higher the mathematical certainty of the disease later on.
Yes. If a child has an ACE score of 4 or more, their risk for chronic pulmonary disease increases significantly. Their risk for depression spikes by 460%.
460%.
Yeah. And their risk for suicide attempts increases by over 1,200%. The scandal is that we have absolute, incontrovertible proof that childhood trauma causes adult disease. We have the blueprint of the burning building.
But our medical and societal models are just painting over the smoke damage. We wait 30 years and then prescribe blood pressure medication or antidepressants, completely ignoring the root cause.
Right. We treat the adult symptoms with pills and procedures, but we do almost nothing systematically to heal the childhood trauma that generated the disease in the first place.
It is a profound failure of integration. And this systemic failure to protect and nurture developing brains extends directly into how we structure our schools. Which brings us to Scandal 4. The text takes a very hard look at modern education systems, particularly focusing on the psychological cost of highly competitive models.
And specifically, the author examines the tension in Asian education models.
Right, the systems that constantly top the global charts.
Exactly. Countries like Singapore and South Korea are consistently heralded globally because they absolutely dominate the PISA rankings, the international assessments of academic performance. But Imbert points out the horrifying hidden cost of this intense pressure cooker environment.
What's the cost?
Skyrocketing rates of academic anxiety, severe sleep disorders, clinical depression, and tragically, youth suicide.
Oh, it's so sad.
It is. The text frames this as a profound ethical tension. Society is basically purchasing academic excellence and high test scores with the well-being and literally the lives of its students. It forces us to ask what the actual purpose of education is. Is it to create a functional, healthy citizen, or is it to create a high-scoring data processor?
Which is incredibly poignant when you consider that as an educational strategy, turning kids into data processors is already obsolete. And that brings us to Lesson 5. The text gets into this regarding the era of artificial intelligence. If we were just teaching kids to memorize and regurgitate facts, aren't we just training them to be second-rate computers?
We absolutely are. Memorization is dead. The text makes it very clear that in a world where AI can recall, synthesize, and output basic data in 3 seconds, structuring a school around memorized testing is just absurd. The irreplaceable human competencies of the 21st century, the things we should be teaching, are creativity, critical thinking, adaptability, and deep empathy. The ability to connect disparate ideas and navigate ambiguity.
But instead of fostering those deep human skills, we have systems that either crush kids with pressure or, as we saw recently, just abandon them completely, which leads to Scandal 5. COVID-19 digital educational inequality.
Yeah, the pandemic acted as a brutal revealer of digital educational inequality. The text notes the data showing that disadvantaged children suffered learning losses 2 to 3 times greater than their privileged peers.
Oh, 2 to 3 times greater. And it wasn't because of a lack of intelligence, right? It was purely due to a lack of basic infrastructure.
Yeah.
No computer, no reliable broadband internet, no quiet space in the home to actually study.
Exactly. It was a stark, undeniable demonstration of how our education systems often act to reproduce and widen social inequalities, rather than compensating for them.
So, if the system is this broken, if it's crushing kids with pressure or abandoning them to inequality, what is the most effective way to actually intervene? Does the author offer a structural solution?
Yes, and it's a powerful one. This is lesson 6. The most powerful structural intervention highlighted in the text actually centers on demographics. It points to convergent global data showing that the economic power of girls' education is staggering.
Really? More than other interventions?
Yes, each additional year of a girl's schooling is cited as the most economically efficient development policy on the planet.
Why is it so uniquely powerful, though? Why does it outpace, like, infrastructure or business loans?
Because of the cascading effects. When a girl stays in school longer, she marries later, she has fewer and healthier children, her earning potential rises, and she invests a significantly higher portion of that income back into her family's health and her children's education.
Ah, I see.
It creates this virtuous cycle that disrupts transgenerational poverty and trauma.
That.
It generates health and economic benefits that cascade across multiple generations. It's the ultimate systemic intervention.
But that requires long-term thinking and stability.
Yeah.
And reading through these sources, it feels like everything in our modern environment is designed to prevent long-term thinking. We are constantly trapped in the immediate reactionary present.
Which brings us to a massive driver of that instability, and this is Scandal 6, the algorithmic radicalization of social media.
Yeah.
The text heavily analyzes how digital networks deliberately engineer what are called filter bubbles.
Right.
They're designed to capture and hold human attention by prioritizing outrage, emotional contagion, and cognitive saturation.
And just to be clear for the listeners, the author cites the 2016 and 2020 U.S. elections, as well as the Brexit vote, as prime examples of this algorithmic manipulation. And while those are obviously incredibly politically charged events, we want to reiterate that the text isn't taking a left-wing or right-wing side here, right? We aren't endorsing any political viewpoint.
Absolutely not. The text is entirely agnostic regarding the political outcomes. What it is indicting is the mechanism. The business model of these platforms requires the deliberate engineering of division. Disinformation and political demonization aren't accidents or bugs in the system. They are the optimal way to maximize engagement and profit.
It's a feature, not a bug.
Exactly. It is a form of structural violence against our collective attention and our democratic stability.
And the sociological term the author uses for the result of all this, which I think perfectly describes that exhausted feeling you get after doom scrolling for an hour before bed, is liquid modernity, which is lesson 7.
Yes, drawing on the concept by sociologist Zygmunt Bauman.
I love how the author frames this. It's the idea that social media creates a societal state where human bonds and shared realities can never actually solidify. Think of it like trying to pour the foundation for a house, but you're pouring the concrete into a rushing river.
That's a great analogy.
The artificial current of the algorithms keeps society in a constant state of anxious suspension. Nothing is allowed to settle. Everything is reactionary noise.
So if we look back at this first part of our deep dive, we have a terrifying macro-level diagnosis. We have a society that is failing the body through toxic nutrition and ignored transgenerational trauma. It's failing the mind through the algorithmic amplification of anxiety, and it's failing the future through education systems that either crush students, abandon them, or prepare them for a world that no longer exists.
We are biologically and psychologically producing exhausted organisms on a mass scale.
We really are.
Okay, we've talked about how institutions fail society on a macro level, from the classroom to the internet. But I want to zoom in even further. What happens when a human body is entirely trapped inside one of these failing institutions? How does that systemic violence actually look and feel on a micro level? Because the source material takes a very sharp, very harrowing turn here in part 2.
It does. We are moving from sociological theory to raw, documented personal reality. The documents contain the author's meticulous documentation of being detained in Serbia. It serves as a chilling, micro-level case study of the institutional violence we've been discussing conceptually.
And the guiding principle the author establishes before diving into the horror of this detention is profound. It's lesson 8, the idea that the law is the last language of the traumatized.
Yes. When effective structures disintegrate, when your family, your community, and the basic social contract fail to protect you, the legal framework becomes the absolute final tool to defend your human dignity. Specifically, the text points to the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR.
Right.
When the physical body is under total siege, the abstract concepts of the law are the last language you have left to assert that you are a human being.
But the terror of this specific account is what happens when you speak that language perfectly and the institution simply refuses to listen. Let's look at the medical neglect the author documented. This is Scandal 7. The text details a horrific manipulation of psychiatric medication during this detention.
The detainee, the author, was subjected to what can only be described as the weaponization of medicine through gross negligence. The documents show they were given varying, powerful psychoactive drugs, specifically Rivotril and Largactil, without proper information, without informed consent, and without regard for the profound neurological impacts.
How does that even happen? How does a medical professional in a state facility just pump someone full of powerful tranquilizers and antipsychotics without a clear protocol?
The text frames it as a complete collapse of medical ethics within the carceral system, and it gets worse. After manipulating these powerful drugs, the authorities abruptly deprive the detainee of all therapy for months. They just cut it off.
Oh my God.
All while completely ignoring the detainee's known and documented neurodivergent status.
To abruptly withdraw psychoactive medication from a neurodivergent individual who is already locked in a highly stressful carceral environment, that isn't just negligence. That is chemically inducing a psychological crisis.
It is a profound violation of bodily autonomy and neurological stability, and unfortunately, the physical environment of the cell was just as hostile as the medical treatment. Which brings us to Scandal 8. The bedbug infestation.
In reading the text, this is explicitly argued as a direct violation of Article 3 of the ECHR, the prohibition of inhuman or degrading treatment.
Yes. The detainee was placed in a cell infested with bedbugs, and despite constant pleas for disinfection, the authorities ignored it. This resulted in documented permanent skin lesions and constant physical distress.
I think it's important to pause here. When people hear bedbugs, they might just think it's gross or uncomfortable. But we are talking about a locked cell. You cannot leave. You are being eaten alive every single night. You cannot sleep. You are constantly itching to the point of permanent scarring. And the people whose literal job it is to care for you are ignoring you. The psychological toll of that, the sleep deprivation alone, is literal torture.
And that passive environmental violence was compounded by direct physical human violence, which is Scandal 9. The documents record specific blows delivered by identified guards. The text names Agent 2359 and Agent 2216, as well as severe violence from co-inmates.
And again, the true scandal highlighted by the author isn't merely that violence occurred in a prison. Tragically, we know that happens. The scandal is the institutional complicity. There was zero effective protection from the prison administration, despite constant written documented warnings from the detainee. The administration just watched it happen. Or rather, they actively chose to look away.
And the method they used to look away is perhaps the most Kafkaesque and terrifying part of this entire ordeal. This is Scandal 10. The text refers to it as the bureaucratic erasure or the lost file.
This part of the text genuinely made my blood run cold. Everyone has experienced the frustration of bureaucratic incompetence, like spending 3 hours on hold trying to cancel a cable subscription because no one will take responsibility. Now, magnify that frustration by 1,000 and imagine your physical safety, your sanity, and your life depend on it.
It's unimaginable. The author notes that Serbia has a very detailed rule book on enforcement of detention. On paper, the detainee had explicit rights. So the author did exactly what you were supposed to do. They wrote endless detailed letters to the ombudsman, to the constitutional court, to the prison governor. They meticulously logged every incident in a factual journal. They spoke the language of the law perfectly.
Oh, what was the response?
Total bureaucratic silence.
It's the nightmare of the phantom legal system. You have a rule book that explicitly says you are protected. You follow every single rule, you ring the alarm bell exactly how the institution tells you to, and you realize the bell isn't connected to anything.
Exactly.
The text argues that this silence isn't an accident or mere incompetence. It is an administrative tactic designed to destroy the individual through sheer psychological exhaustion.
Which brings us directly to Lesson 9, a crucial legal lesson drawn from this horror. A right without effective recourse is no right at all.
Right.
The author uses this experience to prove a violation of ECHR Article 13, which guarantees the right to an effective remedy. The existence of a human rights law means absolutely nothing if there is no practical, accessible way for a victim to enforce it while the abuse is happening.
It's just ink on paper if the person holding the pen refuses to read it. And the author draws a broader conclusion from this deeply personal torture, extending it beyond just the prison system. That's lesson 10. The text argues that neurodivergence is a massive political blind spot.
Yes, this is a vital synthesis. The author explains that institutions, not just detention centers, but our schools, our workplaces, our medical systems, inflict structural violence on neuroatypical bodies through what they call forced normalization.
Meaning the institution demands that a neurodivergent brain process trauma, process stress, and process sensory overload exactly like a neurotypical brain does. And when it inevitably can't do that, the institution punishes the individual for failing to conform rather than adjusting the environment.
Exactly. The institution doesn't just fail to accommodate, it actively traumatizes by demanding an impossible biological and psychological conformity.
Okay, we need to take a deep breath here. We have mapped the macrosocietal trauma, the failing schools, the toxic food, the epigenetic scars, and we have descended into the micro-institutional nightmare of the Serbian detention center. Now, in part 3, we have to ask the critical question, bridging these two worlds. How does bureaucratic violence actually cross the blood-brain barrier?
That's the core question.
Right. What is physically happening inside the cells of someone who is trapped in that kind of systemic dissonance? We are transitioning from legal documents into the biophysics of trauma.
We are moving into the biology of the collapse. And that starts with a radical redefinition of a word we use all the time, which brings us to lesson 11, burnout.
Right. When I hear burnout, I usually think of a psychological state. You're working too many hours, you're stressed, you're just feeling sad, you lose your motivation, so you take a long weekend, or you try to practice mindfulness. But the text completely rejects that framing.
The author argues that burnout is not a mindset problem. It is an entropy crisis.
An entropy crisis.
Yes, it is a literal biophysical loss of energy due to clinical noise and institutional dissonance.
Explain that mechanism to me. How does a bad environment cause an entropy crisis?
Well, your body and brain require massive amounts of biological energy just to maintain baseline stability homeostasis. When you are placed in an environment characterized by sensory overload, continuous threat, or bureaucratic impossibility, your nervous system goes into overdrive. You are constantly scanning for danger, constantly trying to interpret confusing signals.
Which leads right into lesson 12.
Exactly, lesson 12. Sensory overload destroys bioenergetic transmission. The text points out the biological correlates of violence. Precariousness literally alters your neurochemistry. Institutional violence modifies your epigenome, as we discussed earlier.
So the body is leaking massive amounts of energy just trying to maintain basic equilibrium in a chaotic environment. It's like trying to run a high-performance computer processor while someone is constantly dumping sand into the cooling fan. Eventually, the system overheats and shuts down. That's the burnout.
Exactly. The continuous sensory and psychological overload destroys the body's ability to transmit bioenergetic signals efficiently. The text states bluntly, our societies are biologically producing exhausted organisms. You cannot mindfulness your way out of a cellular energy deficit.
So, if the trauma of the modern world is draining our cellular batteries, how do we recharge them? How do we fuel that engine to survive the sandstorm? I absolutely love how the source text frames this next concept, lesson 13. It describes nutrition as thermodynamic exegesis.
It's a very dense phrase, but a remarkably beautiful concept when you unpack it.
Let's unpack it because it completely changed how I think about lunch. To use an analogy, we usually think of eating as putting gas in a car. You burn 2,000 calories, you eat 2,000 calories. It's simple math. But the text describes the food we eat as canned sunlight.
Right. And digestion isn't just a basic chemical breakdown, like dissolving an aspirin in a glass of water. Digestion is an exegesis, a deep, complex extraction of kinetic forces.
The text actually mentions quarks and photons. So you're saying that when I eat a carrot, my body isn't just extracting vitamin A, my mitochondria are acting like microscopic nuclear reactors, breaking down the bonds of that plant matter to extract the kinetic energy of the sun that the plant absorbed, and then using those literal photons to power my conscious thought.
That is exactly the biophysical reality the text is pointing to. You aren't just consuming calories to make a number on a scale go up or down. You are absorbing light and thermodynamic energy to power your sovereign intention. You are pulling energy from the universe to maintain your specific frequency against the crushing noise of the world.
That is profound. And because nutrition is this literal transfer of universal energy, the text demands what it calls absolute nutritional vigilance, which is lesson 14.
If your body is already in an entropy crisis from trauma or burnout, if your battery is at 1%, you simply cannot afford to put confusing or inflammatory data into your system.
And the text is incredibly specific here regarding how to stabilize what it calls the mitochondrial turbine. It calls for the strict exclusion of inflammatory foods. It specifically calls out eggs, peanuts, and crustaceans. And then it advocates for the targeted supplementation of elements like vitamin K2, vitamin B9, and selenium to optimize cellular respiration.
The underlying logic is that you have to tune the biology before you can tune the psychology. If your gut is inflamed, your immune system is panicking, and your mitochondria are starving for basic micronutrients, your nervous system is going to be sounding a continuous blaring alarm. And if the biology is constantly screaming that it is under attack, the mind can never, ever rest.
Which leads us to a crucial philosophical point about how we interact with that biological alarm, and this is lesson 15. The text says that pain is information, not a permanent dwelling.
Pain is absolutely vital for diagnosis. If you accidentally put your hand on a hot stove, the intense pain is essential information telling you to remove your hand immediately to prevent severe tissue damage. The pain is a necessary signal.
Right. But what happens when the alarm never turns off? Like in the case of the chronic stress, the epigenetic trauma, or the institutional nightmares we've been talking about. If you can't take your hand off the stove because the stove is your life, what happens to the pain?
That is the exact danger the author highlights. If the pain becomes chronic, and more importantly, if you begin to identify with the pain, it becomes fatal to the architecture of the self. If you build your house inside the alarm bell, your frequency becomes entirely defined by the dissonance. You stop being a person experiencing trauma, and you become the trauma itself.
Wow.
The text argues that you must receive the painful information, use it to diagnose the dissonance, and then you must actively transmute it.
Which is the perfect seamless bridge to our fourth and final section. We have diagnosed the systemic dissonance. We have seen the bodily collapse. Now, how does the source text propose we actually fix it? How do we transmute the pain? We are diving into what the author calls the Codex of Spectral Harmony.
This section is fascinating because it outlines a very specific, practical architecture for healing, but it draws heavily on ancient alchemical metaphors. It brings us to lesson 16. Transmutation requires 3 steps, summarized by the Latin phrase, solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate.
Let's break down those 3 steps because the sources provide a highly visual, almost meditative protocol for this. The first step is called nigredo.
Nigredo is the blackening, or the dissolving. When you are hit with a wave of severe anxiety, pain, or institutional dissonance, the natural instinct is to immediately fight it, suppress it, or panic. Nigredo asks you to do the opposite. You suspend the verdict, you breathe out, you just observe the heavy, dark tension, what the alchemists call the lead, without immediately trying to fix it. You just deposit the heavy matter and sit with the uncomfortable static.
It's the hardest step, honestly, just letting the noise be noise for a second. But once you dissolve that initial panic, you move to the second step, albedo.
Albedo is the whitening, or clarifying. The text describes this as selective silence. Once the initial wave of panic has dissolved, you mentally scan your body and you force yourself to name the central core need that is hiding behind all that dissonance. Are you feeling anxious because you need physical protection? Because you need a clear boundary with a family member? Because you need intellectual clarity on a problem? You wash the raw emotion until you expose the pure core need.
You pan for the gold in the mud. And once you find that core need, you move to the final step. Rubedo.
Rubedo, the reddening or fixing. This is the moment of action. But it cannot be a frantic reactionary action. The text compares it to firing an arrow. It must be a sovereign, irreversible act that completely aligns your why with your how. You take the clarified intention you found in albedo and you transform it into a physical reality. You enforce the boundary. You leave the toxic environment. You change the diet.
Dissolve the noise. Clarify the need. Fire the arrow. It is a brilliant framework. But it requires radical, unflinching self-reliance. Which brings us to lesson 17, a concept the text calls the Universal Resonance Manifesto, specifically the idea that the patient is the architect and the practitioner is merely a tuning fork.
This is a direct challenge to how we normally view medicine and therapy. Healing never comes from the outside. A doctor, a therapist, a spiritual guide, they cannot fix you. The text argues that the practitioner merely provides a clear, stable frequency. They act as a tuning fork in the room. But the subject, the patient, is the only one who can actually do the internal biophysical and psychological work to tune their own frequency to match it.
You cannot outsource your own transmutation. You have to do the work to resonate. But the beautiful, hopeful part of this theory is that once you do achieve that stable frequency, it doesn't just stay inside you. It has an outward physical effect on the world. This is lesson 18. The text calls it the fundamental law of expansion. Coherence is contagious.
It posits that a stable frequency will naturally pull unstable, dissonant frequencies toward it by its simple presence. If you walk into a chaotic, anxious room and you are holding a strong, coherent, grounded signal, you don't actually have to fight the noise. You don't have to yell over the chaos. The environment will naturally begin to synchronize with your stability.
But to hold that kind of powerful, stable signal, you have to have immense clarity about what is real and what isn't. If your worldview is built on delusions or confused categories, your signal will eventually shatter. Which brings us to lesson 19, a vital concept the author calls epistemological hygiene.
Yes, this is crucial. To understand the complexity of the world without being overwhelmed by it, we have to keep our categories of knowledge rigorously clean. The text uses a framework called the Prisma des Odyssées to explain this.
Let's break this down for the listener because the terminology gets a bit esoteric here. What does it mean to keep categories of knowledge clean?
It means you cannot mix levels of proof. The author insists we must strictly separate three distinct types of knowledge. First, you have documented, verifiable history. The text uses the Khazar Empire or the Alain people as examples. These are facts you can prove with archaeology and documents.
Right, historical reality.
Second, you have active contemporary phenomena that we can observe but perhaps cannot fully explain scientifically yet. The text mentions crop circles as an example of an observable phenomena that shouldn't be confused with established historical fact.
Okay, so history is category A. Unexplained phenomena is category B. What is the third category?
The third category consists of conceptual metaphors and esoteric frameworks. The text frequently mentions egregores and sigillaires.
Can we define those quickly? Because those sound like terms that could easily confuse someone's epistemological hygiene if they don't know what they are.
An egregore is an esoteric concept referring to a collective thought form or a shared psychological field created by a group of people. Think of the vibe or the distinct culture of a massive corporation. It feels like it has a life of its own, independent of any single employee. That is an egregore.
That makes a lot of sense.
And sigillaires refer to specific architectural or structural concepts within the author's own philosophical framework.
Okay, I see the danger now. The author is explicitly warning us that if you try to use a purely conceptual metaphor like an egregore to prove a hard historical fact, or if you use history to validate an esoteric belief, you lose your intellectual grounding. You slide into conspiratorial thinking, you lose your grip on reality, and you fall right back into the dissonance we are trying to escape.
Precisely. Epistemological hygiene is about knowing exactly what kind of tool you are holding in your hand, a historical fact, an observation, or a metaphor, and using it only for its intended purpose.
Which brings us to lesson 20, the ultimate synthesis of Alan Imbert's entire massive body of work. The final takeaway: we must build neurocompatible societies.
Yes. The transformation of our environment isn't just a utopian dream. It is a strict biological, political, and ethical imperative. We have proven through the epigenetics of famine, the epidemiology of allergies, the trauma of the ACE studies, and the horrors of carceral bureaucracy that the human organism is fundamentally incompatible with the world we have built.
We have to start blaming the individual for overheating and start fixing the cooling system of the society itself. We must replace the noise of fragmented, stressful, toxic systems with the clear signal of coexistence. We have to design the world to fit the delicate, miraculous human nervous system rather than relentlessly crushing the human nervous system to fit the demands of the world.
Let's take a step back and look at the sheer expanse of ground we've covered today.
It has been a truly incredible journey. We started with the macro failures of society, how colonial famine literally rewrote the DNA of survivors, how we mentally blame people for systemic failures, and how our schools are acting as pressure cookers while algorithms shred our social fabric into liquid modernity.
We descended into the micro-nightmare of the Serbian detention cell, witnessing how the law becomes a phantom when institutions use medical neglect, physical violence, and bureaucratic erasure to break a human being.
We went deeper still, past the blood-brain barrier into the mitochondria. We saw how burnout is an entropy crisis and how digesting canned sunlight is a thermodynamic necessity to power our intentions against the noise.
And finally, we rose up into the architecture of transmutation. The alchemical process of dissolving the noise, clarifying the need, and fixing the intention. The realization that you must be your own architect, that coherence is contagious, and that keeping a clear, hygienic grasp on reality is our only way to build a world that doesn't destroy us.
It is a massive intellectual achievement by the author. But if there's one core message that rings out above all the data, all the history, and all the philosophy, it's a reminder that you are not condemned.
You are not. You are not condemned by the epigenetic scars of your ancestors. You are not condemned by the traumatic environments you survived as a child. And you are not condemned by the failing, dissonant institutions that surround you right now.
The plasticity that makes us so vulnerable, the fact that our biology can be warped by our environment, is the exact same mechanism that makes transformation infinitely possible. The piano keys can be untaped, but you cannot wait for the institution to do it for you. You must take the reins. You must become the architect of your own matter.
Because if you don't define your frequency, the noise of the world will define it for you.
And that brings me back to the challenge I want to leave you, the listener, with today. We talked about the Universal Resonance Manifesto. We talked about how coherence is contagious. The text proves that a stable, grounded frequency alters the biophysics of the room around it by its mere presence. You don't have to shout, you just have to resonate clearly.
So as you look at your family, as you look at your workplace, as you log on to the internet, what is the frequency you are projecting into your environment right now?
Are you just absorbing the anxiety, the outrage, and the chaos of liquid modernity and reflecting it right back into the world? Or are you doing the hard alchemical work to hold a stable note? Are you adding to the deafening dissonance? Or are you the tuning fork that the room desperately needs? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structures around you, keep a vigilant eye on what you feed your mind and your mitochondria, and keep tending to your own frequency. We'll see you next time.